Dachau was where it all began. Opened in 1933, just weeks after Hitler came to power, it was the prototype for the Nazi concentration camp system. What started as a prison for political opponents soon expanded into a site of mass suffering. Jews, Roma, clergy, resistance fighters, and countless others passed through its gates. By 1945, tens of thousands had been murdered there. But nothing could prepare the US soldiers for what they would see when they arrived on April 29, 1945. When the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Rainbow Division approached Dachau, the first thing they encountered was a train. 30 boxcars stood on the tracks outside the camp. Inside were the bodies of more than 2,000 prisoners who had starved to death or suffocated in transport. Some were so decomposed that soldiers could barely identify them as human. Others looked freshly dead, as though they had collapsed only hours before. The stench was overwhelming. The sight was indescribable. Hardened combat veterans, men who had fought through Italy, France, and the Battle of the Bulge, were left in shock. Many gagged. Some wept. And then came the camp itself. When the gates of Dachau swung open, the Americans found a living nightmare. Thousands of emaciated prisoners staggered toward them, so thin they looked like skeletons wrapped in skin. Piles of corpses lay stacked like firewood outside the crematorium. Barracks reeked of disease and rot. One soldier described the scene as hell on earth, worse than the battlefield. Another recalled, "The men who walked out to greet us weren't alive, they were ghosts." For the liberators, the emotions were immediate: horror, disgust, and rising fury. Among the chaos were the perpetrators, the SS guards. Some had fled before the Americans arrived, but many remained. Armed SS men had lined up outside, awaiting capture. Others hid inside the camp. A number of Dachau's guards had already surrendered, hands raised, weapons thrown aside. Normally the procedure was clear: disarm, detain, and hand prisoners over for processing. But Dachau wasn't a normal battlefield. The sight of the guards, healthy, fed, and in uniform, standing only yards from the skeletal prisoners they had tormented, sent a jolt of rage through the Americans. One liberator later recalled, "They looked well fed, they looked smug, and behind them were the starving prisoners. We couldn't stand it." The soldiers weren't just liberators. They were human beings who had just stepped into a crime scene of unimaginable magnitude. They weren't prepared to act as police. They had just discovered the evidence of genocide. And it was in that moment, in the shadow of the crematorium, that the line between discipline and vengeance began to blur. Not long after the Americans entered Dachau, a group of SS guards was rounded up and assembled near a coal yard along the wall. Witnesses described dozens of soldiers standing in neat rows, their weapons confiscated. Some looked terrified, others indifferent. At first they were simply being detained, but the sight of the skeletal prisoners nearby, men and women who pointed at these guards and shouted accusations, sparked something uncontrollable. Survivors cried out in German, "Murderer! Killer!" Many begged the Americans not to let the guards live. Then, without orders from high command, US soldiers opened fire. Machine guns roared, and in seconds dozens of SS men fell. Accounts vary, but estimates suggest between 12 and 17 were killed immediately, with others wounded or finished off later. The coal yard wasn't the only site of bloodshed. All over Dachau, SS men tried to surrender, and not all lived to see captivity. In some cases, guards were lined up and shot on the spot. In others, US troops handed weapons to freed prisoners, who turned them on their former tormentors. Individual soldiers, overcome with fury, executed guards who resisted or who had been identified by survivors as particularly brutal. By the end of the day, historians estimate that between 30 to 50 guards were killed, though some suggest the true number may have been even higher. It wasn't only American soldiers who took action. Freed inmates, many of them weak and sick but driven by rage, attacked guards with fists, sticks, and whatever tools they could find. In one documented case, survivors beat an SS officer to death with shovels. For men and women who had endured years of torture, starvation, and humiliation, this was the moment they had waited for. One witness recalled, We wanted them to feel one drop of what we had suffered. To some witnesses, what happened was catharsis. To others, it was a breakdown of military discipline. A few officers tried to stop the shootings and restore order, but emotions were too raw. These men had just seen evidence of industrial-scale murder. They weren't simply soldiers anymore, they were human beings responding to the unimaginable. One American officer later admitted, "We went crazy. You couldn't walk through those barracks, see those bodies, and then look at the SS without wanting to pull the trigger." Dachau's liberation should have been remembered only as a moment of freedom, but that day vengeance walked hand in hand with justice. The Americans had freed thousands of prisoners, yet in doing so, they crossed a moral line that history would never forget. And in the coming days, their commanders would be forced to confront a troubling question: were these executions a war crime, or an inevitable response to evil? By the evening of April 29, 1945, Dachau was in chaos. Thousands of prisoners had been freed, dozens of SS guards lay dead, some executed by American soldiers, others beaten by inmates who seized their only chance at revenge. For survivors, it was both liberation and reckoning. For the US Army, however, the events raised disturbing questions about military conduct. News of the shootings reached commanders quickly. Officially, prisoners of war were supposed to be treated under the Geneva Conventions. Executing unarmed men was, by definition, a violation of military law. Yet everyone who walked through Dachau's gates that day knew the circumstances were anything but ordinary. Appointed military governor of Bavaria soon after Dachau's liberation ordered an inquiry. Testimonies were taken. Photographs documented the coal yard where SS men had been gunned down. Witnesses described prisoners pointing out guards who had brutalized them, and soldiers responding with immediate gunfire. But Patton himself was no stranger to battlefield rage. He recognized the danger of prosecuting American troops for actions committed in the heat of such a discovery. Within weeks, the report was quietly shelved. A handful of soldiers faced minor disciplinary action, but no one was court-martialed. The official records were buried in military archives for decades. Historians continue to debate the morality of what happened at Dachau. On one hand, it was clearly outside the bounds of military justice. The guards were disarmed. Many posed no immediate threat. From a legal standpoint, it was a war crime. But others argued that the shootings were a human response to an inhuman crime. The soldiers had walked into a crime scene of genocide. Thousands of bodies, skeletal survivors, evidence of gas chambers and medical experiments. Expecting calm, detached professionalism in that moment might have been unrealistic. Survivors themselves often defended the Americans. To them, Dachau's SS deserved no trial. One survivor later said, "For us it was justice. They killed without mercy. Why should they have been spared?" The Dachau massacre, as it came to be known, became one of the most controversial moments of the war's end. It didn't overshadow the liberation itself. Tens of thousands of lives were saved that day, but it forced the world to confront a difficult truth. Even liberators, when faced with pure evil, can cross the line into vengeance. For the soldiers of the 45th and 42nd Divisions, Dachau left a scar. Some spoke openly of their actions, insisting they would do it again. Others never mentioned it, haunted by memories of both the camp's victims and the executions that followed. Dachau stands today as a memorial, a reminder of human cruelty and the cost of silence. But the events of April 29, 1945 also leave us with an uncomfortable question. When confronted with atrocity on such a scale, was it justice or was it revenge? What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.